Uh, in this session, the title is Indo-Pacific Affairs. We have 7 speakers. Dr. Krishnendra Menon is from School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And Dr. Vibhuti Bhushan Vishwas is from Central University of Jharkhand, that is from our department, Department of Politics and International Relations. Dr. Rasri Padi, but she will not be participating today because she has some pressing problem at home. We have Dr. Aparna, Assistant Professor from the same department at Central University of Jharkhand. We have Dr. Subhas Kumar Baitha, Dr. Priya Madhulika Ikka, and Dr. Mubarak Ali, all assistant professors from the same department. The topic for today is Indo-Pacific Affairs, and I'm not aware of Dr. Krishnendra Meena's paper or the title of the paper, but I have the title of the papers by other scholars. Dr. Biswas is going to deliberate upon geostrategic importance of Quad in India's Indo-Pacific policy. Dr. Aparna will speak on strategic future of India, European Union cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. Dr. Subhas Kumar Baitha will speak on India's growing security architecture in Indo-Pacific, a case study of Indo-Mauritius convergence. Dr. Priya Madhulika Ikka is going to speak on Strait of Malacca, a strategic engagement through the prism of Andaman and Nicobar Islands in context with Indo-Pacific region. Dr. Ali Mubarak is going to speak on maritime governance in Indo-Pacific, administrative challenges and responses. Now, before I invite them, I wish to introduce the theme, how strategically and otherwise also the region Indo-Pacific, the maritime region Indo-Pacific has come to acquire great prominence in the recent past. We are all aware of Alfred Thayer Mahan. He once said, whoever controls the Indian Ocean will dominate Asia, and the destiny of the world will be decided on its water. Indo-Pacific constitutes the confluence of these two oceans, that is Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and is a minor conduit of international trade, energy, with vast littoral and a densely populated region. It is one of the fastest growing regions as well, with valuable source of fishing, mineral resources, and is of great geostrategic significance. Its governance and security are under constant threat, both on account of state as actors and non-state as another set of actors. And the major threats are not only from the states because of the contestation over the maritime zone, the exclusive economic zone, and other resources at sea are concerned, but is also under threat on accounts of pirates, smugglers, terrorists, then furtive naval competition between states, and the region has been gaining great significance over the last couple of decades. It has been increasingly growing active and emerging as a center of gravity in the maritime strategic world. So the region becomes a center of activity on account of several factors like contestation on command over maritime waters like South China Sea, conflict over maritime exclusive economic zones, maritime boundaries, increased trade and commerce, energy transfer through its lanes of communication, threats from piracy, as I pointed out, terrorism, transnational crimes. So, all these put together has led to increased militarized, or it is getting increasingly militarized, thereby escalating the prospects of flare-ups in the maritime region. And it has also grown into an arena of geostrategic competition on account of mutually distrustful littorals, which are creating hindrance towards development of any concrete security architecture. So both, there is no doubt about it that both China and India, which are the major powers of the region, are the geopolitical keystones of the Indo-Pacific region. The in I think the entire contestation of different varieties have started with a change in nomenclature from Asia Pacific to Indo Pacific. This too has given rise to debate and conflict. The term Indo Pacific has been increasingly in use since 2010 in geopolitical discourse. So, China has been adopting aggressive behavior towards its neighbors in the region. And it is said that German geopolitician Karl Haushofer, he first used the Indo-Pacific in the 1920s in his multiple works on geography and geopolitics. And later on in in 2000, August 2007, Japanese PM Shinzo Abe referred to the confluence of Indian and the Pacific Ocean in his speech to the Indian Parliament. And since then, the contestation about the nomenclature has begun because in most of the Western documents, the term Indo-Pacific is being increasingly incorporated or used. So the region as a whole is increasingly witnessing new forms of competition and contestation for influence to create a leverage for different countries or different littorals of the region, maritime region, to create a geostrategic space for themselves. And this has transformed the global commons into contested areas. I'm not going into the statistics in terms of the quantity of vessels which constitutes the commercial fleet in this maritime region, the billions of tons of the transportations that takes place through the region, and it has increased many fold over the last say 3-4 decades. And also the energy flows which is happening across this maritime waters uh, is this all adds to the increasing significance of the Indo-Pacific. And Indo-Pacific in itself is rich in natural resources, which from some accounts, more than 40% of world's offshore oil production happens in its basin. Fishing accounts for almost 15% of world's total, and it has increased many fold between say 1950 to 2020. And mineral resources are also available on the seabed in nodules containing nickel, cobalt, iron, sulfide deposits of different varieties. All these have added different dimensions to the region. It is a home to more than 2 billion of people, and thus the region creates tremendous opportunities as well as tremendous challenges. So all these have led to wide contestation among the major powers as well as other littorals. And it is in this backdrop of geostrategic significance and significance of this global common that the Indo-Pacific for India and China and for other countries of the region, have been devising their own naval strategy and maritime policy, and obviously keeping their national interest into account. So, all these are adding further to the escalating conflict or gradually escalating conflict in the maritime region. And, India was not too cautious about its maritime assets earlier, but in the recent past, it has been it has become cautious, or it is increasingly becoming cautious about its maritime assets. But earlier, it hardly ever thought of having any maritime strategy. It was only an account of China's growing influence in the region that India has acquired, or India has started building its own maritime strategy. China, on the other hand, seemed to have been cautious of both resources within the maritime zone as well as the importance of power and control over sea. So China has been proactive in accordance with Mahan's thesis, and it has subsequently been endeavoring to transform water as weapon, and it has, to a great extent, according to many scholars, successfully has done it. So scramble for maritime resources have already begun in the region, and India too has been growing increasingly cautious and evolving strategies, alliances, policies to protect and exploit its maritime resources in furtherance of its own national interest. And it is in that context that we have been reading quite a lot about Quad, that quadrilateral security dialogue, which is being seen as more of a Chinese containment mechanism than any net security provider in the region. And just 3-4 days back, the 25th edition of Malabar 21 exercises commenced, and I think it is going to continue till tomorrow, that is August 29th. So, China considers it as ganging up of India, US, Australia, and Japan against itself. So the question remains as to how far Quad will deliver any success story towards making the maritime region of Indo-Pacific a peaceful zone rather than creating any flare-up. And by now, Quad has acquired a number of dimensions, like the Indo-Pacific strategies of European countries and the EU, which I think one of my speaker is going to deliberate upon, its partnership with ASEAN and its members, its closer ties with between the India and the United States, and how it is going to shape itself in the region. Then maritime security in the is the major issue in the Indo-Pacific region. So put together, several challenges are there so far as Indo-Pacific region is concerned, or you can also put it together as Indo-Pacific affairs. Challenges like preserving freedom of navigation for commercial shipping, sustainability or sustainably and equitably harnessing the ocean's natural resources to the interest of all the littorals in the region, then establishing protocols for enhancing disaster prevention and relief, as well as search for rescue operations if something untoward happens on the waters or inside the waters, countering piracy, terrorism, smuggling, illegal weapons, proliferations, and then managing the international naval competition, and giving it a constructive or positive direction. So given all these challenges, I am sure during the next 1.5 hours, the different scholars are going to deliberate upon different dimensions of the Indo-Pacific challenges, prospects, and opportunities. Maybe both India and China and other regions of the countries are blessed by geography, but they are also compelled by imperatives or the growing imperatives, one after the another. Hence, the Indo-Pacific maritime region forms both a theater of opportunity as well as a region full of challenges. So if a particular country considers it as theater of opportunity, then how it devises its policies, which must harness to the fullest and fulfill its own national interest. So the biggest challenge, to put it simply, remains to ensure the Indo-Pacific region that it stays secure, and I don't know how far it would be correct to make this statement, out of China's grip. So with this brief remark about the regions, maritime regions growing significance over the last, say, 2 or 3 decades, I wish that the scholars in the next 1.5 hours should touch upon these different dimensions We have 6 speakers, so I think we have 1.5 hours roughly, 1 hour for 40 minutes or so. So maybe 15 minutes each should be the ideal. And I would request all the participants that kindly adhere to the time. And if you can wind up your deliberations, less than 15 minutes, we will get more time for interactions at the end. So with this, I invite Dr. Aparna uh, as first speaker because she has some pressing requirements at the family level. So kindly bear up with me. Dr. Aparna, if you are there, switch on your video and make your presentation.
Thank you so much, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you are audible.
Actually, sir, I got some problem in my video. I'm trying it again and again, but it is not working. Hope you will not mind it. Shall I go ahead, sir?
Yeah, please.
Okay. A very good afternoon to this august gathering. Thank you, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal and NICE, for providing me and my Department of Politics and International Relations, Central University of Jharkhand, a truly global platform. Thank you, Chair, sir, for giving this opportunity to speak on. I hope and wish that this academic event will see the journey of its success. Today, I'm going to present my research paper titled Strategic Future of India-Europe Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific Region. Before I start my presentation, I would like to start with the quotation of our first Prime Minister, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. While speaking in the Constituent Assembly debate in 8 March 1949, he was speaking and he was emphasizing on the importance of the geopolitical location of India. And this was the time when this visionary leader has thought of and has dreamed for India as a global leader. Look at his words. Quote, look at the map. If you have to consider any question affecting the Middle East, India inevitably comes into the picture. If you have to consider any question concerning Southeast Asia, you cannot do so without India. So also with the Far East. While the Middle East may not be directly connected with Southeast Asia, both are connected with India. Even if you think in terms of regional organization in India, you have to keep in touch with the other regions. The words that Pandit Nehru is speaking in the Constituent Assembly debate, he was having the idea and the sense of geopolitical location of India and its importance. For sure, this is not the first thing which has given an international prestige and status to the India, which India is enjoying right now. But rather than that, so many other things are there which has given India this international prestige. Presently, so many things have changed and shifted in Indian foreign policy. Earlier, we were adhering to so many other things. Now we have shifted, we have changed our priorities. And the cooperation that I'm going to look into about the India-European Union cooperation in this region of Indo-Pacific region specifically is going to shape not only this region, but the future of this globe as well. Our present Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Shangri-La Dialogue speech has strongly underscored the importance of free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific region. This Indo-Pacific region has become a major geopolitical region witnessing competition, cooperation, contest, and likely confrontation among major powers. As the chair of the session was talking about the natural resources and the potential that this Indo-Pacific region holds on, this has caught actually the attention of all the major powers, and EU is also part of it. India's growing interest in having an important role in building the Indo-Pacific security architecture is getting reflected in its actions as well. While we are talking about Indo-Pacific region or creating or restructuring the architecture of Indo-Pacific region, we cannot do so without discussing about China. and its power trajectory and its strategic ambitions in the Indo-Pacific region, because its behavior is so very much assertive, not only in this region but worldwide, right? So there is obviously a pressure on China by the rest part of the world to adhere to the norms and also follow international legal principles. The European Union has got a huge stake in the Pacific region, like India, and would like to be a part of its security architecture too. European Union's perception on China had changed drastically. It considered China as an emerging threat to EU's interest in the Indo-Pacific region. China has been perceived a highly intimidating in the name of peaceful rise. China's strategic posturing has been a source of concern for all the major parts, including EU and India. Both would require to understand the relevance of their bilateral convergence of interest on the Indo-Pacific region. Especially, EU's perception on Indo-Pacific region and its probable cooperation with India is being debated at track 1 as well as the track 2 level. Right. Both these, EU as well as India, have shown a high degree of maturity and reflected their convergence on a number of pertinent issues relating to global security during recently concluded India-EU Virtual Summit. In my presentation, I would like to focus on those 5 pertinent areas in which both these potential partners, both these potential parties can work together in shaping the strategic future of Indo-Pacific region. The first is for fighting with the piracy. EU's quest for maritime security interest in the Indo-Pacific region can be understood by assessing various initiatives which they have taken over the years. In the maritime domain, both the EU and India have come a long way in understanding each other's role and how they have come together and protect their mutual interest. The new Information Fusion Center, Indian Ocean Region in New Delhi, IFC-IOR, has recently linked up with the Maritime Security Center, Horn of Africa, MSC-HOA, established by EU NAVFOR Atlanta. The role of EU in fighting piracy and promoting security in the Indian Ocean region through its operations, EU NAVFOR Atlanta was a significant step. This EU NAVFOR Operation Atlanta has been deployed in the Western Indian Ocean region since 2008 as a part of international effort to fight piracy off the coast of Somalia. EU NAVFOR also provides protection to the vessel of the United Nations Food Programme, which delivers vital humanitarian aid to the population of Somalia. There are similarities in the EU-India approaches to resolving piracy issue. So this is very important because as the chair said was also talking about that this route is so very much important and it's a lucrative route for international trade and business. So if there will be such kind of threat like piracy in this route, definitely the development, the kind of peaceful rise of this region, the kind of free, open and inclusive dream is being, as the our Prime Minister was saying during the Shangri-La speech, that this region should be free from all the kind of threat, then only this will be a prosperous region. So in fighting with piracy, both these partners can work together at a very important stage. The second important thing is for establishing democratic values. As we know that Indian Pacific region holds key position in the international politics. With the immense cultural and religious diversities it has, the most dynamic growth worldwide. Since 1960, we know that EU has been working as a regional organization and is a role model of shared sovereignty. In other hand, India has also a proud legacy of democracy and peace. With the shared vision of democracy, rule of law, freedom, inclusive growth, in the mid of July this year, India-EU has signed over India-EU Strategic Partnership, a roadmap of 2025. This partnership will enable India to invigorate its security dimension in the Indian Ocean and Himalayan region too. In the second hand, if you will see that EU holds the capacity to deliver Indian needs, right? So perhaps globally, EU is already working with USA and Japan in search of alternatives to China's ambitious Road and Belt Initiative. Through different policies such as Quad, Sagar, ACTIST, various military and strategic pacts like Malabar Naval Exercise, Scope India Exercise, Japan Ministry of Defense, new arrangement of cooperation and coordination with India and Australia, USA's Indo-Pacific Strategic Report, Australia's Defense Strategic Update, and India-Australia shared vision of maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region, etc. We are finding that both these partners are sharing so much of things together, and they are dreaming together. So there is a fair chance of collaboration at this stage as well. The third point on which I want to emphasize on is about soldering blatant militarization of the region. As we know that China's growing assertiveness and provocative behavior in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly in the South China Sea, is looming the war hysteria. In counterbalancing move, America's heavyweight presence in dragging the region towards militarization and enabling it to become a kind of grand chessboard. So newly imposed visa restriction sanctions on 24 Chinese companies by the past Trump administration will exacerbate the US-China relation as well. Interestingly, to assert new maritime claims unlawfully, these Chinese companies were engaged in creating artificial islands in the disputed South China water. In the spillover effect, if you'll find that Russia has also sent its reinforcement in the eastern border with China and wider Asia Pacific region. Perhaps the smaller economies of the region are always reluctant to be drawn into any kind of new conflict. But now they have this acute realization over the shifting geopolitical landscape in the region. India's political department, sloppy calculation of projected economic power, as well as its expectations on security are acute. Still, India holds the latent capacity which may give an eloquent regional counterweight to China. So India's geopolitical advantages and EU's monetary as well as technical support together will build a multi-ferous coalition in this region, and which may create a kind of peaceful environment in this Indo-Pacific region, which all the small countries of this region are looking forward positively towards it. The next thing which I want to point out is about the alternatives to the debt trap diplomacy which China is playing so long and so aggressively. It is equally harmful for India, equally harmful for the European Union, and it is equally being harmful for the rest part of for the countries though who are surrounding this region. As a responsible regional power, India needs to make a new start in the wake of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, because scars of this pandemic will pull small economies to get to get caught into Chinese bandwagon as well as debt trap. As the Asian Development Bank has forecasted negative growth in Asian countries, which is worsening due to the geopolitical tension and US-China trade war. China is blamed here for tempting developing or underdeveloped countries to borrow money and later controlling them if they surrender the paying off of their loans in time. The ambitious BRI project
Dr.
is...
Aparna, if you could wind up because your 15 minutes are getting over.
Okay, sir. So of course, this alternative for giving an alternative to this debt trap policy also, which China is playing already there in Mongolia, Maldives, Montenegro, Pakistan, Djibouti, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan. It is important for EU as well as for India to work together on this. The next thing which I want to put upon, sir, I'm just concluding it in 1 or 2 minutes, not more than that. For implementing just convention on the law of the sea, as we know that UN clause is said to be a constitution of the ocean, but it lacks kind of universal acceptability. China is as a signatory also, although China is a signatory to this UN clause, but it is not fulfilling the terms and conditions as well as its norms particularly. So it is important for EU as well as India both that for keeping peace in this Indo-Pacific region, both should work together, especially for taming out the assertive behavior of China. It would be important to see, and for seeing the for creating a new architecture here, security architecture in this region, in the Pacific region, it would be important for both of them to work together and to see that at what level, on what level, and what stages their interest as well as their cooperation can be built up. Thank you so much, sir, for giving me the time. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aparna. I think the participants must have observed that Dr. Aparna was trying to help us know as to how India is aiming and crafting its initiatives to expand its relationship with another important global player, that is 27-member European Union. And it would be quite interesting to watch over next few months or a few years as to how European Union, followed by the major or leading European countries like France, Germany, UK, and Netherlands, are able to synergize their how they strengthen their synergies with India. So I mean, it was indeed a very new a very new thing that she has tried to share with us. Thanking you once again. May I now invite Professor Krishnendra Meena from Jawaharlal Nehru University to present his paper.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. In fact, my work is a little easier than the people who are looking at Indo-Pacific, because if you look at the program, the only thing which is mentioned there is that I'll be speaking on Indian Ocean. And more specifically, it becomes easier for me because of the initial remarks made by the chair, as he was referring to Alfred Thayer Mahan. My paper, on the other hand, is about the work of Halford Mackinder, who is considered to be a land power theorist, and he is considered to be one of the founding fathers of geopolitics in general. Otherwise, he is also known for other things, but nonetheless, what is important is that he is a geopolitical thinker. And my contention in this paper is that though he's known for his works on land power and heartland and geographical pivot of history, my paper looks at his work and argues that he was equally informed about the importance of Indian Ocean, and he was equally informed about the importance of sea power in his understanding of the geopolitics or the geostrategy of the world. That is the idea which I have. And for my non-submission of topic, I can just say that I was asked for a tentative title, but that tentative title could never develop into a proper title. But now I have one. The title of the paper is that British Imperial Vision of the Indian Ocean, with reference to the works of Mackinder. And I also still believe that the point of reference from an Indian perspective should be Indian Ocean, not Indo-Pacific, because of the simple fact that the kind of resources required to require for India to reach or to make its presence felt in the Indo-Pacific are not available as of now with India. So Indian Ocean is the correct framework where India should work. And I'm looking at the historical perspective, how British viewed the Indian Ocean as, and specifically Mackinder. India, from an economic perspective, we all understand that was the most important colony for British Empire. On the other hand, geopolitically, the imperial vision accorded immense significance to the Indian Ocean. Halford Mackinder, considered to be a land power theorist, advocated and highlighted the significance of the Indian Ocean repeatedly in his prolific career. So the paper highlights that his work was intended to preserve British sea power by focusing upon the geographical pivot of history, or the impregnable landmass, which was later named by him as the Heartland. And there are a number of works, I'll mention them, and I'll also quote extensively from Mackinder's work, these works, wherein he's arguing that Indian Ocean was a strategic linkage with both Mediterranean and East Asia for the British. And he argued that the defense of the Mediterranean is vital for its access to the Indian Ocean. And similarly, the connectivity offered by the ports in the Indian oceanic space to the east is economically vital. So as important, the Indian Ocean is as important to them as Mediterranean to ward of France and Russia as it is for the connectivity towards the east. For him, the Bombay and Colombo ports were coveted locations on the high street, which begins at London, and emphasized that Colombo is one of the chief communication centers of the world. And therefore, the aim of the paper is to clarify that Mackinder valued British sea power, and it was to create a defensive framework for the same, that he highlighted threats emanating from the Heartland. And in this schema, the heavy British presence in the Indian oceanic space served two purposes: defense towards the east from other European powers, and the economic function of exploitation of the Indian beaches. His ideas have influenced repeatedly debates over global strategy. Keynes, for example, one of the scholars, Jerry Keynes, suggests that Mackinderian vision of geopolitics was used to address the dilemma of preserving British supremacy in the face of competition from newly industrializing countries in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it was also improvised later to actually to give a sort of an intellectual reply to the Nazi expansion on the continent. Mackinder's work, specifically 3 books and a journal article by him, are very important to understand how much importance he accords to the Indian oceanic space. If you look at his work in these 4 works, namely, and I'll also tell you the years of publication, because then we get a chronological order for his publications, and also the gradual improvement in his ideas. So the first work is Britain and the British Seas, which is explicitly about how Britain, more about how Britain and the seas around it should be controlled and how Britain does control them. This was published in 1902. In between, if you remember, if followers of Mackinder know that in 1904, he wrote a very interesting paper called The Geographical Pivot of History, which still evokes a lot of response around the world. Then in the year 1910, he's focused specifically on India, calling his collection of lectures on India as 8 lectures on India. And then in 1919, his work on Heartland comes out, wherein he develops the geographical pivot of history into Heartland. The work is called Democratic Ideals and Reality. And lastly, there is this article called Round World and the Winning of Peace, which is again emphasizing the importance of the globe being, the Earth being a spheroid, and again, why the heartland is important. But in this one, there is this understanding that the Earth's surface is occupied more by oceans than terrestrial landmass or the landmass. So we will look at, and otherwise also, if we look at Mackinder himself as a person, we find that he was a very influential person in the British setup. Right? We find that he had been he had been an ambassador to Russia. He was influential in setting up of departments of geography in at least 23 universities in the United Kingdom's education system. He was the chairman of the Imperial Shipping Committee for a good 19-20 years. And he was one of the founders of the London School of Economics and Political Science. So he was a member of parliament also from Glasgow. So in that sense, he had these kind of a multi, he was a kind of a multi-personality who had this influence in the British system and who could actually make an influence in the policy making in the British government. And he had a very prolific career. So now we look at his work about Indian Ocean and try to understand why did he actually provide so much of importance to Indian Ocean in his work, whereas the normal understanding about his work is that it is only about land power and the geographical pivot of history or the heartland. But in fact, it is equally, Indian Ocean is equally important in his work. First, he realizes that Indian Ocean is a closed ocean and is the only one among the four large water masses. So the ocean is enclosed by Antarctica towards the south, land masses of Africa to the west, Asia to the north, and islands of Southeast Asia and Australian landmass to the east. Right? And we now know that it garners a lot of attention because of the sea lanes which carry trade towards Europe in the west, as well as to the Asian economic giants, China, Japan, and South Korea to the east. Historically, the European colonizers in Asia used these lanes of communications for trading and strategic purposes. In the case of Indian Ocean, the British almost had a stranglehold over it, to the extent that it was referred to as the British Lake. And Mackinder's vision is similar, and he says, and I quote, he says that perhaps the most remarkable outcome of the British sea power was the position in the Indian Ocean during the generation before the First World War. He says the British Raj in India depended on support from the sea, yet on all the waters between the Cape of Good Hope, India, and Australia, there was habitually no British battleship or even first-class cruiser. In effect, the Indian Ocean was a closed sea. He says Britain owned or protected most of the coastlines and remaining frontages were either on islands as the Dutch East Indies or on territories such as Portuguese, Mozambique, and German East Africa, which all the continental were inaccessible under existing conditions by landway from them. So he has this understanding that it is a British lake and there is this unity to the British Ocean, which is provided by the British presence on all its expanse. Further, he says that the British are a very important sea power. He understood that British are a very important sea power. They are a naval power, and it is through their naval prowess that they were able to create this huge empire. He says that on sea power, thus, British adventurers have founded an overseas empire of colonies, plantation depots, and protectorates, and have established by means of seaborne armies. They've been able to create local land powers in India and Egypt. And he further explains, so impressive have been the results of British sea power that there has been a tendency to neglect the warnings of history and to regard sea power in general as inevitable, having, because of the unity of the ocean, the last word in the rivalry with land power, because they were able to do so much with sea power. He understands that it is possible that in the future, land power will be neglected, and thereby his understanding of heartland and the geographical history. We find an elaborate explanation of the role of sea power in the First World War, which follows this book. And his great fear, which led to initial imagination of the pivot and later the heartland, was the unity of sea power on the world island of Eurasia. So he argues that because of this unity which is there in the sea power, because of the presence of 71% of water or oceanic mass on the planet, the heartland is always threatened. Further, he coming back to the Indian Ocean, he further outlines that the importance of British trade, which runs through the sea lanes to and from the United Kingdom to India. He exhorts that from London to Colombo and Bombay is a naval high street of the British Empire. At Gibraltar, Malta, and Aden, where the waterways narrow and enemies might obstruct, are British garrisons and naval stations. So that is a kind of his visualization of the Indian Ocean in relation to the British Empire's work, right? And he connects it from London to Colombo and Bombay. He says the revenues which are earned from the control of shares in the Suez Canal, which was otherwise essential for the peaceful movement of merchant ships and the Royal Navy fleet, were presented as an advantage for the British. And he then explains the kind of money the British were earning, or the British Exchequer was earning from the Suez Canal. The similar things are happening still in the present context. We know the importance of Suez Canal. We came to know the importance of Suez Canal only in April, when there was this huge ship which was stuck in the Suez Canal. Further, Mackinder argued that Colombo is one of the chief centers of communication in the world. Someday, he says, when the dominion beyond the seas have grown to be as rich and populous as Britain itself, the way through the Mediterranean, today all important, to be reckoned as one of the several equal threads of imperial power. And I further quote, other great streams of traffic, India bound, will then converge upon Colombo from the Cape in the southwest, from Australia in the southeast, and by way of Singapore from Canada in the east. Colombo's geographical location at the center of the Indian Ocean, connecting traffic from the Mediterranean, Atlantic seas of East Asia and the Pacific, was vital for the British trade and remains today for the major powers operating in the region, including India. So that importance historically has been the same, but it is only the presence of the rise of China and its presence in the Indian Ocean which is causing more formulations about the Indo-Pacific, such as Indo-Pacific. India's location within the Indian Ocean and the peninsular geography is posited as a geostrategic advantage. The position of the southern geographical end of the peninsula has tried the sea lanes of communications running from east to west and vice versa accords India a favorable situation. And that too was also visible to Mackinder. From Cape, he says, from Cape Comorin, two coasts diverged, the one known as the Malabar coast northwestward for 1,000 miles, and the other known as the Coromandel coast north and then northeastward for a like distance. So that is, he is totally aware that there is this Cape Comorin, which is now known as Kanyakumari, which is striding the sea lanes of communication. The Indian Peninsula is jutting out in the Indian Ocean, and it overlooks the sea lanes of communication. He connects the Southeast Asia and East Asia with a very wonderful study.
So last 1 minute, sir.
Okay. I'll take two, but I'll finish very fast. He says that the Indian Ocean connection for the British rule Myanmar and its geographical and imperial linkages are highlighted by Mackinder by suggesting that Burma is in relation with the Indian world, for it has a great navigable river, that is the river Irrawaddy, which drains into the Indian Ocean and not into the Pacific, as do the rivers of Siam and Annam. So he connects that, and then he follows this with examples of migrations of labor, which are carried from natives of Madras. They go to work in Burma, and from there he travels to Kolkata. The workers from Bihar and Bengal traveling to South Africa through the port of Calcutta. And that connection he makes to again establish that there is this specific unity about the Indian Ocean. And such kind of unity has also been established by a very recent scholar and a very wonderful historian, Sugata Bose, who argues that the Indian Ocean should be understood in terms of its immediate connections, linkages, trade, commercial, and military exchanges over the centuries. So the whole idea about this, I'm winding it up, is to look at Mackinder's work and find in them the importance of Indian Ocean, the importance of sea power, and to look at the Indian Ocean unity in this context, and to understand that he was not only a land power theorist, but much more than that. And to ignore his work on the Indian Ocean, it could perhaps be a little sort of ignorance. It points towards kind of an ignorance. With those words, I'll stop, and I thank again the chair for this session, and also thank Dr. Jaiswal of NICE for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot. Indeed, a very new dimension, because from what comes out from your deliberation, that Mackinder has been largely underscored so far as vast amount of geopolitical discourse is concerned, which has been happening now all over the academic world. And Mahan has been promoted as the advocate or proponent of sea power. So you gave us a very new dimension that even in Mackinder's literature, there is a tremendous amount of emphasis on sea power. So I mean, that requires to be understood in right perspective. So overall, it was a new knowledge to us. I myself would try to delve more into Mackinder's theory to understand as to how he has dealt more dealt with both, that is his heartland theory and the importance of land power as well as the importance of sea power. May I now invite Dr. Vibhuti Biswas to make his presentation. Thank
you. Very good afternoon to all. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the chairman of the session, Dr. Alok Kumar Gupta, for giving me this opportunity, and the organizer of this conclave, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, for arranging such a wonderful conclave, such a big conclave here organized. So thanks to him also. So I'm going to present my argument in terms of Quad and India's geostrategic policy and Quad. So in my paper, because it is just around 15 minutes the chairman has given, so I will take certain argument and counter argument in terms of understanding these Quads. So there are so many scholars, they are discussing many ways, and they define that it is a kind of India is engaging with all this Quad and certain kinds of things to counter China. So there are certain argument in favor of this and certain counter argument of this particular issues that I will make. But before going into detail, that you know that the common idea of Indo-Pacific for this Quad members are free, open, inclusive, prosperous, stability, and stable and secure this region. That is the main common idea for all these Quad members. But before going into detail, so let me quote that our Prime Minister Narendra Modi, what he said. He said that, quote, the Indo-Pacific is a natural region. It is also home to a vast area of global opportunities and challenges. That he has given, unquote. He has made this statement. So his statement means India does not see the Indo-Pacific as a strategy or a club of limited members, nor a grouping that seeks to dominate, not directed against any country. That is the statement that our Prime Minister Modi he made. And from his argument, you can see that very clearly we can see what exactly the India's standpoint is. And then again, another statement by our External Affairs Minister, S. Jaishankar. He made a statement and he further clarified the Indian stand in terms of Quad and joining this Quad and in Indo-Pacific, whatever grouping is going on. That all the time now China and other countries, they given a coin a term that it is Asian NATO. So in that, Jaishankar has clearly, again, he made a statement and he tries to again clarify to the whole world that what India think about this particular Quad members and what is there exactly India think about. So here, what he said is on the Indo-Pacific, the big point I made was that the Indo-Pacific is for something, not against somebody, and that something is peace, security, stability, prosperity, and rules. That means we are talking about free, open, inclusive, prosperous, stable, and secure. So that is the argument I want to start from this statement. And you know that that Quad, before that these four countries, they were making very separate statements, but in the very recent in March 2021, so jointly they have made a statement and came together and they made a statement. Before this meeting, there were different type of statements are coming from different countries. And what happened is due to formation of this Quad and increasing tension in the Indo-Pacific, several commentators, they declare it as a new Cold War is going on or started in the region. In March 2021, you can see that in Chinese the newspaper, that is Global Times, what they have mentioned is it is very clearly that on news it came out that India seeking countership with Quad, a negative assert of BRICS, because you see India is part of BRICS and SCO. So that's why China is trying to say that okay, it is when you are a member of Quad, and that will make it a kind of negative impact on BRICS or SCO. That is a argument made by the Chinese government in the Global Times. And the next point again is we have some scholars they are making is India is tilted toward USA, and that's why Russia is tilting towards China. That is a argument. People are mostly people are making argument, but in that aspect, if you want to see that impact of Quad in long-term allies, what would be the impact India is going to face? As Professor C. Rajamohan, he has made certain kind of point, and he said due to Chinese growing military power and its attitude, India is forced to ally with this Quad. Otherwise, because of Chinese aggressiveness particularly in Indian Ocean, so it is for India. The Chinese is forcing India to join with such type of group and formations of such type of so-called NATO as given by China and other certain like-minded Chinese. But here in this context, we can assume that that in case of any tension between India and China, what I believe is that Japan or Australia, even the USA, they will side it with India, and India will get a boost of in terms of dealing with Chinese aggressiveness in the region. So that may be another reason why India joined this Quad. So that also some scholars there are arguing in a different way also. And the another factor is you can see Chinese growing military power in the region. That also another factor. And previously also chairman also rightly pointed out in the beginning. And then Chinese growing relation with Pakistan also another factor for India. For what is that is another factor why India was looking for certain kind of grouping so that India can counter terrorism particularly in the region, because you see in the UNSC, United Nations Security Council, China all the time supporting Pakistan and supporting the terrorist whatever activities going on, and all the time China is supporting Pakistan. That also another argument here. And Chinese trade dominance in the regions and dumping, particularly dumping is going on. That also another concern for India because of that this grouping, and because of all the group members also they are facing the similar kind of kind of problem. So it is also again, it is a force to India to join certain group called Quad. And another is the Chinese Road and Belt Initiative. That is what China is you see, India has been opposing of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative because of this project crossing through Pakistan occupied Kashmir. That is also major concern. So that also another argument we can make it. And so that Quad India is engaging as alternative BRI project. I can say that it is a kind of alternative project that India, whatever the BRI project, that is an alternative way India is looking for. So that's why India is formed and a member of this Quad. And for India and USA also sometimes they are trying to put forward what exactly Indo-Pacific mean to them. And all the time they talk about that it start from India and to Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean up to American territory. But they forget about up to the Africa. But very recently, our Indian Prime Minister also very clearly they clarified that Indo-Pacific means to India is from for Asia Pacific, from US to Africa. That itself shows that it is not against of any country. India need a free and a rule-based international order in the region. So, and India considered that the rising Chinese military power has posed threat to India's interest, which include international rule-based order and force and open Indo-Pacific. That is the argument. And then what would be the long-term alliance? What would be the India's long the impact on it? And some analysts believed what the India Quad's engagement may harm India's good relation with Russia. But here, I can put forward certain kind of counter argument that India's joining with this Quad that will not going to ruin fully the Indo-Russia's relations, because still you can see 49% of India's arms and ammunition come from Russia. And very recently, India also have signed MOU with Russia for S-400 the defense system. That also itself. And then again, India now the present situation, whatever is happening there in Afghanistan, on India need Russia in terms of dealing with the terrorist activities, whatever going on in that, and particularly in Kashmir and other part of India. So India need Russia in terms of settling down such type of problems. And then Russia is always promoted, so Indo-Russia, China, that is RIC, trilateral formations, which eventually gave birth to organizations such as BRICS and SCO. So which is India is part of BRICS and SCO, and then again India is part of Quad. So that is the argument that people and the analyst or researcher, they may argue in a different way that say this Quad now India is very much tilting towards USA. So then this BRICS and SCO that is going to maybe for a long time it will be impacted so much. But in that we can see that India is trying to negotiate with including India is increasing its trade with China, and all the time you can say the settled military level talks are going on in terms of whatever tension was there in the border, in the Indo-China border, and Russia also now settling the problems or whatever the aspirations of India in Afghanistan. India is trying to move through Russia. So this BRICS and this SCO is another two organizations that India need these organizations in terms of its economic boost up. So, but I don't think that this Quad is going to normalize or going to put a negative impact on this BRICS and SCO. Because Russia, you see all the time, though it is they are saying that it is a NATO of Asia, but now Quad is being called NATO of Asia. But I don't think that is going to be very much that is not going to impact very much relationship with these BRICS countries or SCO in terms of India's economic growth. And then also India trade relations with virtually you see countering growing Chinese Pakistan nexus also another factor that you need Russia with you so that okay, you can normalize or you can neutralize somehow the Chinese and Pakistan nexus in terms in the particularly in this region, in South Asia region. You need the partner. So another side you see US-Iran tensions that all we know because of sanction. So there is a big problem with Iran. US-Iran tension is going on, but in that India is looking for a Chava support. So that is India's another dream project in terms of transporting India's trade because India's trade and again India's countering Chinese influence in the regions also another dream project that also if India very much involved in the Quad that may impact. That's why India strategically very much a bilateral relationship also India is promoting. And another side, okay, you see that counter argument if we put, then it is a kind of a Quad is a ally that is a grouping, is an alliance of like-minded countries with broader perspective. That broader perspective, what is that broader perspective? As I mentioned before, that it is a free, open, and inclusive, prosperous, stable, and secure region. That is all together. We can say that. And towards the aim
Last
to
1
reduce
minute.
the hegemony of China.
Last 1 minute,
in
Vibhuti.
Indo-Pacific. To ensure open and free passes rule-based international order in the regions. And Russia-India military deal that counter this argument that India will be the puppet of US in the regions. But India is it is I can say finally that India is a very strictly is put forward in a geopolitical strategy in the region. So India is trying to balance one side a Quad and another side India is looking for economic prosperity as well as India wants the partners through which India can counter terrorism in the region. And the present situation in the Afghanistan, India needs very much. India needs to cooperate with China and with Russia, and partially now India is looking for a certain kind of door to negotiate and through dialogue with Pakistan also, so that we can tackle whatever situation there in Afghanistan. So I don't think that again this Quad will put so much of impact on other relations like India-Russia relations and India-Iran relations. So argument is in that way, and it is a very much geopolitical strategy of India, whatever India's standpoint today. And this Quad is all about free, open, inclusive, prosperous, and stable and secure trade and other maritime trades and all India is looking for. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Vibhuti. It was indeed a very unique way of looking at the positive aspects of Quad when the dominant perspective in the available literature happens to be that Quad is going to militarize the region more than it can do any peace-related. It can deliver any peace-related prospects for the future. Already, a lot of experts have started talking about the anti-Quad formation of China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan that I was talking about in the beginning. And there are different assessments and analysis about the prospects of anti-Quad formation. So that is there, but just on the other hand, you have rightly pointed out that this maritime region continues to be a factor of
audio.
Yes, am I audible?
Now you are.
Am I audible?
Yes, now you are audible.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Now you are audible.
Maybe because of different technical.
Mike, you can put little because very low volume is coming from your side.
Okay.
No, it is okay.
I have put the mic right in front of my mouth. Let us see. this maritime region, is the strong determining factor of India's cultural footprint. With people, religion, goods, customs spreading from India to Africa, to Middle East, to Southeast Asia, and vice versa. So, I mean, there are other major stakeholders as well in the Indo-Pacific region, like Japan, Australia, and many others. But then India, happens to be one of the most important stakeholders, because many people see that Indian Ocean is India's ocean. So how far India would be able to regain its lost space into the maritime region through revival of Quad is something we need to wait and watch. Thank you very much for this nice and detailed insight into the positive aspects of Quad. May I now invite Subhas Kumar Baita for his presentation. Subhas.
Thank you so much, sir. And I'm sorry, sir, my webcam is not working.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon to all of you. Respected Chair, Dr. Alok Kumar Gupta, Head and Dean of the School of Social Sciences, DPIR, and my dear colleagues and students. Especially, I would like to give my special thanks to my classmate and research director of NIS, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, who has given me this opportunity to present my view. My topic of presentation is India's growing security architecture in Indo-Pacific, column, a case study of Indo-Mauritius convergence. In the recent decades, the Indo-Pacific has emerged as an important maritime space influencing global politics and the larger maritime security architecture. This region is crucial in the sense that maritime and strategic interests of global powers are visited within it. The rise of China across the Indian and the Pacific Ocean, along with new threats radiating from the maritime domain, further consolidates the necessity of maritime security. So today, the Indo-Pacific region represents the geostrategic reality of the 21st century. All the major powers such as India, Japan, US, Australia are giving attention to this region to counter China and to protect their maritime interests. Concerning India, the country has adopted 3 approaches to protect its maritime and geostrategic interest in the Indo-Pacific region. First, to directly engage with the regional powers and forums such as ASEAN. Secondly, collaborating with small and middle powers such as the Maldives and Sri Lanka, Mauritius and Seychelles, who directly impact New Delhi maritime interests. Finally, engaging in multilateral sector dialogue with global powers such as Australia, Japan, and United States under the ambit of the security dialogue, commonly called the Quad. Under the free and open Indo-Pacific, the security and growth for all in the region and the Indo-Pacific Ocean Initiative, India attempts bilateral or multilateral dialogues in the Indo-Pacific region. Agenda of convergence range from the maritime security, maritime connectivity to capacity building. MEA has also created a separate Oceania division to focus on Southeast Asian nations, Pacific Island states, and the larger Indo-Pacific to maintain the maritime dominance and reduce the Chinese control over the region. Since PM Modi government came into power under the ambit of India's Act East policy and Act West policy, the Indo-Pacific region become the center of India's foreign policy. PM Modi announced the Indo-Pacific Ocean initiatives during the 14th East Asian Summit in 2019 and complements India's Sagar mission. With the help of IPOI, India attempts to consolidate deeper maritime cooperation with major powers and littoral states of the Indo-Pacific. IPOI comes under the broader framework of India's Act East policy with a particular focus on intelligence and connectivity sharing with the ASEAN countries. IPOI focuses on two vital issues that are of the paramount importance for India's maritime security. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, yes, you are audible.
So firstly, discerning the Chinese hegemonic ambitions in the Indo-Pacific, IPOI calls for the multilateral dialogues regarding issue of maritime security. It includes all the countries of ASEAN, littoral powers such as Seychelles, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Mauritius, along with the member countries of the Quad. Secondly, IPOI expects greater connectivity, security, and maritime intelligence sharing among the stakeholders of the region. For India, small powers such as the Mauritius are pivotal to a strategic balance with China and in Indo-Pacific. Using littoral powers, India is in the process of actively extending its rich interest and focus to subvert Chinese assertiveness. The focus of this paper is to understand the changing trajectory of India's Indo-Pacific policy with a special reference to Mauritius. To provide answers to the issue of India's Indo-Pacific policy, this paper is divided into two subsections. First, to provide an overview of changes and continuities of India's Indo-Pacific policy, followed by locating a small littoral states such as Mauritius in India's broader maritime framework. Now, the topic India's Indo-Pacific policy, a brief genesis, I will explain here. The Japanese ex-Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in his parliament address in 2007 and described the Indo-Pacific region as the confluence of the two seas. Since then, India has adopted a proactive Indo-Pacific policy and the focus on the strengthening its maritime and the naval capacity. This paradigm shift in India's maritime diplomacy is evident through the creation of an Indo-Pacific division, the Indian Ocean Rim Associations. Additionally, India started utilizing ASEAN and the Quad forums for the multilateral discussion on issues about the maritime security and geostrategy. However, at the initial phase, India lacked a comprehensive Indo-Pacific policy, but mounting concern about China's expansion in the Indo-Pacific made India's defense and security experts accommodate diverse interests related to maritime security. Repetitive India, China, and skirmishes compelled India's policymakers to be vocal against Chinese aggression both on territorial and maritime space. Since India's independence, Indian foreign policy makers were more concerned about the territorial threats because of the security challenges emancipated from India's adjoining near Pakistan. Thus, the maritime domain was largely ignored at the initial phase. However, the 2008 Mumbai attack made India's strategic community aware of the political threats from sea routes. Additionally, India is now a global exporter and the majority of India's goods pass through seas. So it becomes necessary for India to protect and secure its maritime space. India has been disconcerted by increased Chinese maritime activity in the Indo-Pacific region, which India perceives as dual use to carry on Chinese military and commercial activity. Now, I'll say the India and the Quad. The Quad occupies a central position in Indo-Pacific policy. With the recent resurgence of the Quad, all the members countries aspire to use this forum for greater economic interactions and to maintain peace in maritime space. India, like many other global powers, is worried about Chinese supply chain developing in the Indo-Pacific region and Chinese growing with the Asian nations. So India attempts to use forum like IUR and the Quad to let the global community understand Chinese hegemonic ambitions in this region. There is another reason behind India's proactivism in the Quad. Unlike China, India's maritime capacities are limited. Thus, multilateral agreement is a necessary. And it is a necessity also for India to protect India's interest in this region, especially securing Andaman and Nicobar Island from external threats. Until recently, India had dealt its maritime space with the uncertainty and dependent upon the foreign intelligence. However, that noticeably changed following the border conflict with China, popular anti-Chinese sentiment, and negative economic growth due to COVID-19. All of these factors turned India strongly against the China. Similarly, many Asian countries are also worried about the Chinese aggressive posture in the Indo-Pacific, notably after the Chinese actions in the South China Sea conflict. So from a defense and a strategic perspective, Asian countries also want to shift away from China. And utilizing this growing Chinese apathy, India wants to use multilateral forum to initiate dialogue with the Asian nation. So India's ultimate objectives are securing economic and geostrategic interests. India-Mauritius relations. Now, see the India-Mauritius relations and a growing bond home. In India's Indo-Pacific policy, littoral states occupy a key position due to their geostrategic positions, resources capacity, and the existence of the Indian diaspora community in such nations. Among them, Mauritius is an important partner among the Indian Ocean littoral countries in the region. India and Mauritius share rich cultural, historical, political, economic, military, social, and cultural affiliated. Although diplomatic relations were established in 1948 after India's independence, Mauritius maintained contact or connection with India throughout its history. The Commission of...
You have 1.5 minutes, kindly wind up.
Sorry. During the colonial rule, Indian workers migrated to Mauritius to work on sugar plantation, followed by a huge influence of Indian workers on Mauritius as a laborer. Now I'll come on the conclusion, because there are lots of the material I have to explain here, but with the permission of the chair, I'm coming on the conclusion that even though Mauritius is a small and technological underdeveloped island nation, its geography helps Mauritius to occupy a central position in India's Indo-Pacific policy. Ancestral diaspora connections and the cultural affinities with India helped Mauritius to attract greater developmental, financial, technical, and educational assistance from India. However, the looming Chinese hegemony and pandemic pose challenges in Indo-Mauritius relations. As India is suffering from an economic downturn due to COVID-19, future investment and the developments in Mauritius remain highly unlikely. On the other hand, Mauritius, due to its geographical position at the crossroad of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, has already attracted China. China's recent trade agreements are intended to increase trade with the Mauritius, but also secure its maritime assertive interests. However, India has some added advantage that China lacks. India's special partnership with Mauritius is not based on India's short-term geostrategic ambitions in the Indo-Pacific. With Mauritius, India shares a common heritage of kinship, culture, and language. The cultural dynamic between the two shaped their relations in the past and expects to influence future policy directions as well. Even though the India-Mauritius relationship is not at par, India under the
Suhas, kindly wind up.
Yes, sir. Yes. India under its Act East policy understand the role of a small and middle power to protect India's maritime interests. However, India's partnership with Mauritius is destined to soar even higher in the coming years. Will be decided by proactive leadership, multilateral engagement, and how India can use its cultural assets to secure its maritime interest. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Suhas. Thanks a lot. I understand 15 minutes is too short a time period for dealing with increasing Mauritius' strategic significance for India and many other countries in the Indo-Pacific. As a member of African Union, Indian Ocean Rim Association, and Indian Ocean Commission, Mauritius continues to be a stepping stone to multiple geographies. So given China's peaceful rise in the Indian Ocean, the geostrategic importance of Mauritius and all the other islands, including the Vanilla Islands, have gone up many-fold. So there are, several factors which requires to be dealt with, and time period is too short. Mauritius could be the fulcrum of India's own, African economic outreach. India has realized it late, noticed it late, and China, by now has made considerable inroads into the African continent, and mostly via these island states. So, India has a great lesson to learn in this direction. Thank you very much. A beautiful insight into India's Mauritius relations and its geostrategic significance in the Indo-Pacific. May I now invite Dr. Priya Madhulika Ekka to make her presentation. You have 15 minutes, but if you could wind up in say 12 minutes, it would be over, because I want that last 10 minutes should be there to interact with the audience. Thank you.
Okay, sir. Good afternoon to everyone. Today, I will be presenting my paper on the topic Strait of Malacca, strategic engagement through the prism of Andaman Nicobar Islands in context towards the Indo-Pacific. So, when we speak about the history, For centuries, ports along the coast have been the center of worldwide economic trade and political arena for different cultures and civilizations. One such global hotspot is Strait of Malacca, which is vital from economic perspective and strategic engagement in present maritime domain. The quilted history of the Strait of Malacca illustrates how maritime transportation got geopolitical relevance in international theater. The lively exchange of navigation techniques and the art of shipbuilding has been deep-rooted in the Strait of Malacca. Since the time immemorial, the maritime transportation influenced the development of coastal region, assuming divergent perspectives in present Indo-Pacific region. When it comes to its nomenclature, strait has derived its name from Malacca trading port on the Malay coast, which was of paramount importance in 16th and 17th centuries. Another narrative about the label and genesis of Malacca is found in the reign of Malacca Sultanate. The Arab traders called Kingdom Malacca, which is an Arabic word which means assembly of commercial travelers. Merchants from Asia, Arabia, Persia, and the southern kingdom arrived on Kedah, which served as the western port on the Malay Peninsula. Buddhist maritime empire of Sri Vijaya, based on Palembang, Sumatra was a significant knowledge center and trading hub from the 17th to 13th century. With a strong foothold, Sri Vijaya Empire soon encompassed parts of the island of Sumatra and western part of Java Island. The augmentation of empire Sri Vijaya started mushrooming in maritime Southeast Asia, having full dominance in the Strait of Malacca and the Strait of Sunda. Dominance of Srivijaya kingdom lasted for about 700 years after a successive vanquishment and invasion led to shattering conditions on the probable opponents on the ports of Strait of Malacca and Sunda simultaneously. Trade was in full bloom in the maritime kingdom of Srivijaya, establishing hydrographic ties with China and the commercial exchange of goods and products with India and Arab merchants. The British and Dutch empires drew an arbitrary line in the strait in the 19th century, which became present-day border between Malaysia and Indonesia. The Strait of Malacca as a global trade continued with the rise of modern city-state of Singapore. So it is evident from the historical development over the ages the prominence of Strait of Malacca as a crucial shipping and strategic link connecting major Asian economies such as India, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines, China, Vietnam, Japan, and Taiwan. It's the most crucial point for global trade and natural strategic point for wide economic order at international arena. Strait of Malacca is now a narrow stretch of water, which is a main shipping lane lying between the island of Sumatra, Indonesia to the west, and Manus Peninsula, Malaysia, and extreme southern Thailand to the east. As water, it connects Andaman Sea, Indian Ocean, and South China Sea, Pacific Ocean, viewing from the context of maritime trade, commercial activities, and strategic perspectives. The strait holds a significance at the global platform, especially in Indo-Pacific Ocean. The global security, economic arrangement, and complex maritime environment has undergone rapid alteration in present arena. In the economic discourse and maritime domain, India occupies a strategic and pivotal position in the Indo-Pacific. India's close proximity to Malacca Strait implies India's strong hold on the business and strategic maritime traffic. Geopolitics and topography of India displays a significant role in the region, connecting Southeast Asia in varied aspects such as culture, history, religion, trade, etc. The Andaman-Nicobar archipelago has assumed great status with India's position in the region to balance geographical equation. This island chain, where India shares maritime boundaries with littoral states, that is, Thailand, Myanmar, Malaysia, Indonesia, and mainland Bangladesh, has acquired global attention. However, in the context to maritime domain, plethora of issues, traditional and non-traditional threats are increasing at a fast pace, exploring India's vulnerability. The Andaman Nicobar archipelago has long been perceived as India's key vulnerability due to its remote location. States today encounter a plethora of security issues which are linked to the maritime domain. In recent years, Indian policymakers have been visualizing the large security picture, and therefore new patience has been emerged with the neighboring states and which can be seen in the economic domain through various initiatives such as BIMSTEC, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, economic cooperation, and for larger Look East policy, which is presently transformed as Act East policy. The contemporary global environment, however, is dictated by economic and export-led development. Presently, India owns 95% of its trade moving by the sea, and therefore sea lines are vital interest to India. India's trade interaction in the East, however, has been less in comparison to the West. However, trade with particularly China, US, European Union, South Korea, etc. are increasing and growing at a very rapid pace. India's interest in the eastern sea lines would increase considerably, particularly with the establishment of regional free trade areas that are currently in various stages of implementation. India, however, is one of the biggest energy consumer in the world, and therefore with vast population and rapid growing economy, it is demanding for fossil fuel resources, and therefore the demand have also been met through various import channels. Even though the two overland natural gas pipeline projects in the India's west from Iran and east from Bangladesh, Myanmar, materialize most of the energy imports which continue to be transported via the sea. The Andaman Nicobar Island chain itself is also known to bear substantial hydrocarbon reserves, and therefore, in order to enable the coastal states to harness living and non-living resources within their adjoining seas in an orderly and equitable manner, the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea 1982 bestowed them with the jurisdiction of 200 nautical miles of ocean space termed the exclusive economic zone. The Andaman Nicobar archipelago presently has been of main importance geographically because in few years appropriate measures have been taken to beef up its defense, including the institution of integrated Andaman Nicobar Command. Therefore, an altered geostrategic vision of Indian policymakers, translating it into enabling the Andaman Nicobar chain to play a greater role towards securing India's vital interests in the Indo-Pacific. India has added advantage, which is because of the location of Andaman Nicobar Island in the western entrance of the Malacca Strait. This is they are spread about 800 kilometers in the north-south orientation, adjacent to the western entrance of the Malacca Strait, a major Indian Ocean choke point. The northernmost point is just 40 kilometers from Myanmar and the southernmost 170 kilometers from the Indonesia. In many ways, the islands are the hinge on which India's Indo-Pacific strategy swims between India and the Pacific Ocean. Recognizing the importance, India has therefore established a joint military command, which is headquartered in Port Blair in 2001. The island therefore has a great role in India's defense strategy. With this outpost, it enables it to monitor the hostile vessels from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. Secondly, with the vast and deep portion of the Bay of Bengal, where India will maintain its nuclear propelled ballistic missile submarine is also in domination, and hence with India seeking to cooperate with other existing initiatives also had a great implication on various Southeast Asian regions. With the BRICS, it was established in 1977 with countries like India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Thailand, Myanmar. 5 of these 7 have made this district a ring of countries in the Bay of Bengal, and 2 landlocked states, that is Bhutan and Nepal, are using this maritime link for the trade. India is the now leading country in dealing with sectors of transportation, communication, tourism, environment, and disaster management.
Kindly wind up in 1.5 minutes.
Yes, sir. So another forum like SARC and other policies like Look At policy is also initiating the greater role of India in both continental and maritime orientation. Therefore, India has a shared vision of maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific as a result of Malacca Strait, which it helps to develop. Lastly, I would like to conclude by saying that Indian political leadership with regard to geographical distance and Andaman Nicobar Islands, however, worldwide focus on economic for national development, even interstate terrorism have been relegated to the background. However, the response can adopt a multi-pronged approach, first by building strict capabilities in the Andaman Nicobar, and secondly by fostering security bonds with the maritime borders. The Andaman Nicobar has an immense strategic value, and therefore it can be a springboard for engagement of the neighborhood and conjunction with the political diplomatic role of the Navy. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya. I understand you got less time. Maritime region of Indian Ocean and Indo-Pacific in general has been turning fast into zone of strategic competition. That is a fact of the maritime life. And the Strait of Malacca in the east and the Strait of Hormuz in the west. These are the 2 most strategic choke points in the region. And reportedly, it hosts around 64% of the world's oil trade and the movement of half of the world's carrier ships. So the region also is said to have 40% of world's offshore petroleum. So given mineral deposits and diverse marine ecosystem, the region has acquired great economic importance, and it has raised geopolitical interest of most of the regional powers as well as global powers. So obviously, both these states matters a lot when the great power contestations are getting renewed in the Indian Ocean and Indo-Pacific both. Thank you very much for the insight. May I now invite Muhammad Mubarak Ali for his presentation. You have roughly 12 minutes. Kindly wind up as fast as possible. Thank you. Thanks, Mubarak.
Good afternoon, sir. First of all, I would like to thank Honorable Chair of the session, Dr. Alok Kumar Gupta, and organizer of the seminar, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, for giving me the opportunity to present this paper. The topic of my presentation is Maritime Governance in Indo-Pacific, Administrative Challenges and Responses. We know that water has been a dominant feature in the Earth's surface. Almost about 70% of the planet is covered by water, and a significant portion of the Earth is covered by frozen water in Arctic and Antarctica. The importance of the water on the planet can be understood that 80% of the world's population live on or near the coast. Almost 90% of international commerce travels by sea. About 65% of world's oil reserves and 35% of world's gas reserve are also located in the ocean. When we see historically, great powers have been those who had access to the sea, such as the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Holland, Spain, Portugal, and Japan. So in the literature of international relations, we can say that the security, legal, and economic approach prevails. Maritime governance occupies a prominent space in any international relations and also in the context of Indo-Pacific. The scope of the definition of maritime governance, or we can simply define the governance, constantly expanding definition and description of the governance has been constantly expanding due to the emergence of new phenomena and non-state actors at seas and oceans. The word governance, however, is more comprehensive, encompassing practices and processes aimed at generating a legitimation of authority and encouraging patterns of rule-based behavior. Maritime governance is used as an umbrella term to refer to a variety of efforts aimed at enhancing law and order at sea, the premises for delivering security and growth to a region. This includes more commonly used terminology of maritime partnership, which tends to have a security connotation. It is a vital state function, broadly encompassing safety and security of shipping and conservation of marine environment. It could also be seen as a subset of international ocean governance, which is about ensuring sustainable exploitation and management of the world's ocean and the resources in ways that keep our oceans healthy, productive, and resilient, which is the primary objective of UN Sustainable Development Goal 14. So ocean governance in UN document mainly deals with environment, climate change, and sustainable development, especially after the 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1982, classifies the maritime into three distinct areas, that is territorial water, exclusive economic zones, international waters. Territorial waters are those under government sovereign control and legally recognized as 12 nautical miles from the low water mark of a coastal state. The zone is under the exclusive control of the state, but ships of all nations are allowed a free passage. Exclusive economic zones are the zones which are beyond the 12 nautical miles, which extends seawards to 200 nautical miles. The coastal state has a special right to use and exploit marine resources such as oil exploration, seabed mining, and fishing. The international community still enjoys the rights and freedom of navigation and overflight in the exclusive economic zones, as well as the ability to lay submarine telecommunication cables and other non-resource related uses of oceans. The third is international waters. So beyond 200 mile is considered international waters, where all coastal and non-coastal states have equal access and enjoy the freedom of seas and other activities. So in spite of clearly defined boundaries, maritime disputes are common, where countries compete over inhabited and uninhabited islands. Disputes can be classified on account of non-state and state actors. Some of the important disputes on account of non-state actors is the illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. It is an issue of global concern. Illegal fishing is widely prevalent in both the Indian and Pacific Oceans, adversely impacting the sustainability of fish stocks and thus food security. Then the other dispute of involving non-state actor is terrorism activities. For example, the Mumbai attacks of 26/11/2008. Apart from that, the issue of pirates, 40 naval competition between states, transnational crimes, and also illegal trafficking. Even states are also involved in illegal and contraband goods like ingredient related to weapons of mass destruction, unaccounted transportation of illegal conventional arms through sea, and Indo-Pacific region is no exception to this. In order to tackle these challenges, there are various institutional mechanisms. Some of the important institutional mechanisms in the Indo-Pacific context is the Indian Ocean Rim Association for Regional Cooperation, which was set up with economic objectives in mind. It was initiated in 1997. The other institutional mechanism is Indian Ocean Naval Symposium. It was a naval initiative for the maritime security. It was initiated in 2008 by Indian Ocean Navies. So both IOR, ARC and IONS classify as regional organization with membership based on countries littoral to or within the Indian Ocean. Then another regional institution is Western Pacific Naval Symposium. It is also an organization similar to IONS formed by navies of Western Pacific region. So both IONS and WPNS serve as a platform for regional navies to exchange views and collaborate on tackling common non-traditional maritime threats and challenges such as piracy, transnational crimes.
Mubarak, kindly wind up in 1 minute.
Okay, sir. So other institutional mechanisms include the BIMSTEC and Indian Ocean Commission. So now the question is way forward. And also there are talks in various academics circle or also in international arena that there should be creation of pan-Indo-Pacific institutions. But it is a difficult task given the underlying regional security concerns and the geopolitical tensions involving various Asian states, China, India, Japan, and United States. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Mubarak. I have received a note from the organizers that discussion may not be possible because of paucity of time. We have already touched 14:43. So, I mean, we have just 2 minutes. Now, let me use these 2 minutes to thank all the participants. Dr. Krishnendra Menon from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Dr. Vibhuti Bhushan Vishwas, Dr. Aparna, Dr. Subhas Kumar Baithar, Dr. Priya Madhulika Ekka, and Dr. Mubarak Ali. I understand the last two speakers really had, I mean, near about just 10 minutes to 12 minutes to make their presentations. Nevertheless, it was altogether a very, all the papers were unique, or I can say innovative in their own approach to look at the Indo-Pacific. I mean, they made an endeavor to look at the Indo-Pacific affairs with a new approach. So I'm indebted to all of you for making such nice insights into the different aspects of Indo-Pacific affairs. I'm extremely thankful to Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, the organizer, for having accorded this opportunity to us to make our institution and our department a participant institution. I am sure our association will go a long way, and we will have more of such interactions. Many of my research scholars are into different sessions. They are attending and they are getting benefited out of it. It is truly a grand global platform, I would say, where so many institutions and participating institutions are there, and so many participants with new approaches to different issues pertaining to international relations and international politics are there. So thanks one again, Dr. Pramod, for giving us this opportunity. I'm indeed indebted to you. Thank you very much. We wind up the session. Over to Dr. Pramod Jaiswal.